If you want to wipe out a species, don't use disease or predators. Give them a perfect world. In 1968, 8 mice were dropped into a flawless utopia. 4 males, 4 females. They had endless food and water. No diseases, no predators. Absolutely no threats of any kind. 5 years later, every single one of them was dead, and not a single death was caused by anything a vet could diagnose. Science calls it Universe 25. And you're looking at the most insane social experiment ever designed by man. In 1968, an American scientist named John Calhoun built an area, what he called a mouse paradise. Soft nesting material in every corner, temperature locked at a perfect level, cages manually cleaned on a strict schedule. The 8 founders were the absolute healthiest specimens pulled right from the NIH breeding colony. Calhoun was an ethologist. He spent his entire career obsessed with one specific question: what happens to a society when nothing is hard anymore? He chased that answer for 2 decades before arriving at this experiment. Earlier versions were built in a quarter-acre Maryland forest, then in barn enclosures and lab rooms, 24 of them in total. Each version was a slightly different paradise for rats or mice, with no scarcity, no predators, and no escape. In every single one, he saw the exact same pattern. The population would explode, and violence would spike. Mating would warp into something twisted and hyperactive, then collapse into total apathy, and the colony would die out. Number 25 was supposed to be the perfect run. The clean experiment. The final answer nobody could argue with. Inside a federal research lab in Maryland, he set up a 9-foot square enclosure. Stacked tightly along the walls were blocks of walk-up apartments. Residents navigated through a matrix of wire mesh tunnels running from the floor straight to the ceiling. Scarcity didn't exist here. Food and water pumped in automatically, always endless. Calhoun carefully calculated that this closed ecosystem could comfortably support 3,800 mice. But that number, 3,800, would remain a permanent theory. On day 1, he dropped his 8 founders in and shut the lid. For the first 104 days, almost nothing happened. The mice explored, learned a layout, and figured out who slept where. Then the first litters were born, and the population started doubling. Every 55 days, twice as many mice. By day 315, over 600 animals lived inside, nowhere near the 3,800 capacity. But they climbed all over each other on the ramps, slept in massive piles, and viciously fought for nesting space at the top of the apartments. This is the exact moment everything started falling apart. In a normal wild colony, resources aren't handed out equally. The most brutal alpha males hoard the best real estate. They claim the females and use violence to lock down their territory. The surplus mice just leave. They immigrate and find new ground somewhere else. Inside Universe 25, their instincts hadn't changed, but there was no new ground. The young males, with nowhere to go and no roles to fill, started drifting toward the center of the pen. They pooled together into sluggish, apathetic masses of flesh. Calhoun would stand over the enclosure for hours watching them do absolutely nothing. They were healthy and well fed. They just had no fights to win, no females to court, nothing to protect. When attacked by another mouse, they wouldn't fight back. They would just lie there, take the beating, stand up, walk a few steps, and lie back down. While some gave up, others reacted with sheer hyperaggression. A second group formed at the exact same time on the opposite end of the spectrum. They became frantic and indiscriminate. They moved through the pen faster than any other mice. They forced their way into nests other males were trying to defend, and they completely bypassed the mating rituals every other mouse still followed. They refused to back down, even when brutally beaten by the alphas. And in the darkest corners of the colony, the behavioral system began to shatter. The females responded by staging their own retreat. Those who couldn't find a spot in the social hierarchy climbed up to the highest apartments and lived in isolation. They stopped interacting with males. They stopped reproducing entirely. Calhoun also noticed something he called the behavioral sink. Food was equally available everywhere, but the mice began obsessively crowding around a few specific feeders. They wouldn't eat alone. The presence of others became so hardwired into their feeding instinct that an empty feeder, no matter how full of food, was completely useless to them. Then the crowding got worse and worse around a handful of stations, while the rest of the pen sat practically untouched. The mothers still trying to raise pups started breaking down in a much darker way. Defending a nest in that environment took non-stop effort. The original territorial males burned out from patrolling and just stopped protecting their families. The mothers had to defend the nest themselves while still nursing. They turned on their own young. They kicked their pups out, scattering them across the pen. Some completely forgot which babies were theirs. Others stopped recognizing them as offspring altogether. And in the worst phases, mothers started eating their own young. Death surrounded them from birth. In the worst zones, less than 5% of pups survived to weaning. Calhoun later wrote that at this point, the social fabric of the colony was effectively dead. Their physical bodies still absorbed calories, but the system that kept them functioning as a species was wiped out. The pups that did survive were raised by mothers who couldn't care less if they lived or died. They had no role models for what a normal life inside this place even looked like. And when they grew up, they acted like nothing Calhoun had ever seen. The males of this generation never fought. They never tried to mate. They engaged in absolutely zero social activity. They just ate, slept, and obsessively groomed themselves. Their coats were flawless because they never got into a single scrap. They drifted through the colony like no other mouse even existed. Calhoun named them the beautiful ones. On the outside, they looked like the healthiest mice in the entire population. Functionally, they were already dead. They never tried to breed. They literally couldn't socialize. Their nervous systems developed in a world where every social role was already taken by someone else, and they simply opted out of the species. On day 560, the population peaked at 2,200. The last successful conception inside Universe 25 happened on day 920. After that, not a single new mouse was born. The colony just kept aging. The beautiful ones kept grooming. The isolated females stayed locked in their high-rise apartments. Violence carried on in random pockets with absolutely no purpose left to it. And one by one, the mice died of old age with no next generation coming up behind them. On May 23, 1973, the final mouse in Universe 25 died, 4 years and 10 months after Calhoun shut the lid. He wrote that the mice suffered 2 deaths. The first was the death of the spirit. The second was the death of the body. Their spirits were crushed years before their physical bodies actually gave out. When his paper dropped, the world ran with the most obvious takeaway. Comfort kills. Abundance kills us. A life without struggle is a life that destroys itself. The image of the beautiful ones, looking physically perfect but quietly going extinct, became one of the most heavily quoted metaphors of the late 20th century. Urban planners pointed to it. Religious leaders and politicians on all sides of every issue used it. Anyone looking to warn people about the decay of modern life found something in those mice they could use. But that takeaway wasn't what Calhoun actually said. His real conclusion was sitting right there in the paper, in his own words. For an animal as complex as a human being, he wrote, a similar collapse was not just possible. It was logical. If the number of individuals capable of filling meaningful roles greatly exceeds the number of roles available, only violence and disruption can follow. So the killer wasn't comfort. It was the evaporation of meaningful social roles, the actual reasons we exist. When the population ballooned past the supply of meaningful positions, the surplus individuals essentially flatlined cognitively. The fighters had nobody to fight. The mothers had to protect nests with zero backup. The young grew up with no expectation to inherit anything. And here is the part almost nobody quotes. Calhoun himself wasn't a doomer. He didn't spend the rest of his life predicting the apocalypse. He tried to reverse it. He kept building new universes. He kept tweaking the variables. He was hunting for the one thing he could inject back into paradise to keep it running. He genuinely believed it could be done. He believed humans could make a different choice than the mice did. He wrote that when physical space shrinks, the only way forward is to expand ourselves into conceptual space, into ideas, into networks, into the work of building roles that never existed before. He called it ideational generativity, a long academic phrase for a very simple idea. The way out is to constantly create new reasons to be here. But the experiment is still sitting right there in the data. A perfectly designed utopia. 8 mice, 5 years, a total extinction, and a cause of death no toxicology report could ever name. The mice didn't have a choice, but we still do. What happens next is entirely up to you.